Treblinka did not look like an extermination camp. That was his first and most calculated form of torture. The complex was located in the Mazovian district in the forested region of Mazowsze, Poland. The SS authorities deliberately chose the site because of its isolation. A pine forest surrounded the facility on almost all sides. Access roads were scarce, and the railway line connecting the camp to the Polish deportation network passed through the small town of Małkinia Górna, a railway junction that the Nazis had quietly incorporated into their victim transport network. Construction of the camp began in the spring of 1942. It did not take more than 2 months to be operational. On July 23, 1942, the day mass deportations from the Warsaw Ghetto began, Treblinka received its first transports. On that opening day, several dozen wagons loaded with approximately 6,000 people arrived. The machinery was not yet fully adjusted. The bodies piled up so quickly that for the first few weeks the bodies were unburied for days, generating a stench that was perceptible more than 10 kilometers from the perimeter of the camp. Treblinka was divided into 2 separate but related sections. Treblinka 1 was a classic forced labor camp where Poles, both Jews and non-Jews, were forced to work in the camp's gravel quarry. Treblinka 2 was the extermination camp proper. Both facilities were located less than 2 kilometers from each other in a symbiotic and sinister relationship. While in Treblinka, one death was slow and gradual. In Treblinka 2, it was almost instantaneous. The killing field was approximately 600 meters long by 400 meters wide. Its dimensions were intentionally modest, almost austere. No space was needed to store alive, only to kill. A wire fence more than 3 meters high, reinforced with interwoven branches, prevented the interior from being seen from any outside angle. Watchtowers, distributed at strategic points on the perimeter, completed the architecture of the confinement. Internally, the structure was organized into 2 main zones. The reception and plundering area included the false railway platform, the barracks where the victims were stripped naked, the facilities where women's hair was cut, and the warehouses where everything confiscated was classified. The extermination zone, separated from the previous one by a second interior wire fence, housed the original gas chambers and, later, the expanded building where 10 new chambers were installed. Connecting the 2 areas was a fenced corridor approximately 150 meters long and less than 2 meters wide that the German and Ukrainian guards called Himmelfahrtstraße in German, which literally translates as the road to heaven. This name was no coincidence. It was the last corridor that thousands of naked people traveled, pushed with rifle butts while trained dogs bit their flanks and guards shouted contradictory instructions to maximize confusion and panic. It was the road to the gas chambers, and it had never been so clear to those who walked it what it meant to die. But the most disturbing feature of Treblinka's design was not the barbed wire or the towers, it was the illusion. When a train entered the camp, the victims found a small station carefully made to look real. There were signs indicating fictitious train destinations, a clock with painted hands that never moved, flower pots, signs in 3 languages promising showers and sanitization, fake ticket office windows. The main reception building had fresh yellow paint, clean architecture that evoked a quiet village railway stop. The Nazis knew precisely what they were doing. Every minute that the victims believed they were in a transit place was a minute when they would not panic, they would not try to escape, they would not oppress collective resistance. This architectural deception was in itself a form of psychological torture on a massive scale. The arrival, the first circle of terror. The suffering at Treblinka began before he arrived. In many cases, it started several days before. The sealed cattle wagons in which the victims were deported had no adequate ventilation, no water, and no toilets of any kind. In summer, the interior of the carriages reached temperatures that exceeded 40 degrees. In winter, the cold became so intense that some people died of hypothermia during the journey. The wagons were filled with between 100 and 150 people in a space designed for the transport of livestock, without the possibility of sitting, often impossible even to turn the body. The journey from Warsaw took between 3 and 5 hours, depending on the route and military rail priorities. Trains from more distant cities, such as Białystok, Radom or Lublin, could take between 1 and 3 days. Those who survived the journey arrived in a state of exhaustion, extreme thirst, and disorientation that made them more easily manipulated. Those who did not survive arrived piled against the living, and the living had to remain crushed against the dead for the rest of the journey. What happened inside these cars during transit hours was itself a torture accurately documented by the survivors. The darkness was almost total. The only slits of light came from small openings in the upper wood of the wagon, insufficient for ventilation but sufficient for the outside heat or cold to penetrate without attenuation. The overcrowding was so extreme that when someone lost consciousness, they could not fall to the ground. They were held upright by the bodies around them. Many people died standing and remained so until the car was opened. Thirst was the most universal torment of the journey. In summer transport, testimonies coincide in describing water as the dominant obsession of all those who traveled in the wagons. Some prisoners even drank their own urine. In extreme cases documented in the medical records of the Sonderkommandos who processed the wagons upon arrival, the victims had ingested their own excrement from the floor of the wagon looking for any form of moisture. Young children, with less resistance to dehydration, were often the first to die during the journey. The rail logistics of deportations were administered with bureaucratic precision by the Reichsbahn, the railways of the German Reich. The person responsible for the technical coordination of the transport of deportees was Adolf Eichmann, an SS lieutenant colonel in charge of Section 4B4 of the Reich Security Central Office, specifically in charge of Jewish affairs. Eichmann negotiated with the chiefs of each railway region over track use priorities, journey times, and the availability of wagons, competing in these negotiations with the military transport needs of the Eastern Front. The fact that deportees traveled in cattle cars instead of passenger cars was not just a decision of intentional degradation, it was also a logistical decision that allowed more people to be loaded per convoy and to use wagons that were not needed for troop transport. The central starting point for deportations from Warsaw was the Umschlagplatz, the concentration square located on the corner of Stauki and Zika streets on the northern edge of the ghetto. From July 22, 1942, when the mass deportations began, the Umschlagplatz became the scene of one of the greatest collective traumas in Polish history. Thousands of people waited in that open space under the summer sun or rain for hours and sometimes entire days before being embarked. The Jewish police of the ghetto, the Jüdische Ordnungsdienst, were used by the Germans to manage crowds and complete the daily quotas of deportees. They had to hand over a minimum number of people per day or face deportation themselves. Within the Warsaw Ghetto, the mechanics of deportations had evolved through several phases. In the first weeks of July 1942, the Germans had used a particularly cruel lure. They announced that those who voluntarily presented themselves at the Umschlagplatz would receive 3 kilograms of bread and 1 kilogram of jam before leaving. In a context where chronic hunger killed thousands of people monthly in the ghetto, this offer attracted tens of thousands of people who decided to come forward voluntarily, believing that any fate was preferable to dying of starvation. Many of them arrived at Treblinka in the first transports from the camp. According to the testimony of Jankiel Wiernik, a Polish Jewish carpenter and builder deported to Treblinka on August 23, 1942, and one of the few survivors who managed to escape during the 1943 uprising, when the wagons opened when they reached the camp platform, guards frequently found corpses mixed with survivors. The dead were not given any special attention, they were simply dragged and piled up next to the living who began to disembark. The discharge was shouting. SS guards and Ukrainian auxiliaries stormed the carriages, waving rifles and dogs, physically and violently separating men from women and children. The speed was deliberate. The faster the group was segmented, the less time there was for families to organize, for people to understand what was happening, for any form of resistance to begin. The platform of Treblinka too had the capacity to receive between 3 and 4 carriages simultaneously. When a transport arrived with 20, 30 or more wagons, the unloading process was carried out in batches. The first wagons were emptied, the prisoners were taken to the reception area, and the train advanced so that the next wagons were in front of the platform. This process could take several hours for larger transports. During that time, the people who were still in the closed cars continued to suffer from the conditions of the journey, with no information about what was happening outside, listening to the screams and the chaos of the unloading of the previous cars. The unaccompanied children, many of whom arrived in the transports from the ghetto orphanages, were unloaded by the Sonderkommandos who worked on the platform. Several testimonies describe the image of children of 3 or 4 years old who arrived alone, without understanding where they were, looking for their mothers in the crowd on the platform. The guards made no distinction. The documented minimum age of Treblinka victims, according to records of some deported communities that partially survived in Polish archives, included days-old babies. The men were led to a wooden barracks, the women with the children to another. In the men's barracks, the orders were clear: strip naked, leave all valuables, documents, and personal belongings. In the women's case, the additional order was to sit on benches where Sonderkommando prisoners proceeded to cut their hair flush with scissors. This haircut deserved special attention. The Nazis used the hair of murdered women in the manufacture of industrial textiles, specifically in stockings for submarine crews. The process had a bureaucratic coldness that was disconcerting. The forced cutters knew what was coming next. The victims often do not yet. This gap between the knowledge of some and the ignorance of others was a fundamental part of the mechanics of the Treblinka terror. The objects confiscated in the reception area were classified and stored with a meticulousness that revealed the economic value that the Nazis extracted from the extermination process. Cash from different European currencies was separated by currency. The jewels were classified by material. The clothes were folded and stacked for shipment to Germany, where they were redistributed to the civilian population. Personal documents, photographs, and letters were destroyed. They were the only objects that had no market value, but did have identity value, and precisely for this reason they could not be preserved. This systematic classification was carried out entirely by the Sonderkommandos under armed supervision. The storage area was known within the camp as Treblinka 3 in some internal documents, or simply as the Lager, the warehouse. Boxes and bales of confiscated objects regularly left the camp in trucks bound for distribution centers in occupied Poland. The scale of this flow of stolen goods was such that historians who studied the economics of Operation Reinhard calculated that the total value of what was confiscated in the 3 main camps, Treblinka, Sobibor, and Bełżec, exceeded in today's terms several $100 million, not counting the dental gold extracted from the corpses. Wiernik documented in his written testimony, written shortly after his escape and published clandestinely in 1944, what he observed in those first moments inside the camp. The first impression was one of manufactured chaos: screams in 3 languages, dogs barking, the noise of overturned furniture, the crying of children who did not understand why their mothers were being torn from them. All this combined with the particular smell of the countryside, a mixture of wood smoke, cleaning chemicals, and something more difficult to name. Something that Wiernik described as a sweet and heavy smell that sooner or later everyone recognized as decomposition. No one in Treblinka was given a number, no one was searched, no one was booked. Identity ceased to exist the moment you got off the train because identity presupposed a future, and at Treblinka the future did not exist for almost anyone. That absence of registration was also an absence of possible mourning. In Auschwitz, where prisoners were tattooed and booked, there remained at least the theoretical possibility of tracking the fate of a specific person. There was nothing left in Treblinka. The families who survived the war and searched for their dead found no documents, no numbers, no records. Only the name of the camp as the final destination of a train that had left a city on a certain date, and the absolute silence afterwards. The Himmelfahrtstrasse, the corridor to the chambers, nudes, no belongings, without hair in the case of women, with bare feet on a sand and wooden floor. Thus they began to travel the last 150 meters of their lives. The Himmelfahrtstrasse, the fenced corridor that led from the reception area to the gas chambers, was not simply a passageway. It was an instrument of terror with a specific purpose: to maintain the constant movement of the victims with a speed that would prevent any possibility of organized resistance. The walls of barbed wire and interwoven vegetation prevented him from seeing beyond a few meters in any direction. The corridor was so narrow that people were advancing almost in single file, pushed from behind and beaten from the sides. The guards who supervised this corridor were trained to act in a specific way. The blows with rifle butts were constant, applied to the kidneys, head and back to prevent anyone from stopping or delaying the procession. German shepherd dogs and specially trained attack dogs bit the legs and flanks of those who slowed down. The shouted commands were contradictory, overlapping, impossible to follow. The auditory confusion was intentional. One of the most disturbing elements of the Treblinka system was the use of deception active until the last moment. As the prisoners advanced down the corridor, the guards continued to maintain the fiction of showers. "Faster the water cools down!" they shouted. "There are more people waiting for their turn." This lie had a calculated psychological function. As long as the victim believed that the destination was a disinfectant shower, he would not panic completely. He would not force the use of maximum brute force to maintain movement. The deception was a killer logistical tool. At the door of the gas chambers, one of the most documented characters in the entire history of Treblinka often waited, the guard known in the testimonies of the survivors as Ivan the Terrible. Ivan Marchenko, the most sadistic guard in Treblinka. His full name was Ivan Marchenko, and he was Ukrainian. Marchenko had joined the Soviet infantry on May 27, 1941. He was captured by German forces on July 10th of that same year, during the first weeks of Operation Barbarossa, the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, in which the Germans captured approximately 5.7 million Red Army soldiers in the first months of combat. Conditions in German prisoner-of-war camps for Soviet soldiers were deliberately lethal. The Nazi regime had determined that captured Slavs were not entitled to the protections of the Geneva Convention. In the Chelm camp, where Marchenko was initially held, mortality among Soviet prisoners reached 60% per month in some periods from starvation, disease, and direct executions. From Chelm, Marchenko was transferred to the Trauniki camp, a facility specially created by the SS to convert Soviet prisoners of war into auxiliary guards of the death camps. The selection of candidates for Trauniki was not random. SS recruiters were looking for men who had demonstrated a willingness to collaborate, who had no political ties to the Soviet regime, or who simply preferred anything to continuing to die in prisoner-of-war camps. The training at Trauniki lasted several weeks and included instruction in crowd control techniques, use of weapons, execution procedures, and, crucially, an accelerated anti-Semitic indoctrination process. The guards trained at Trauniki were known as Trauniki-Männer and mostly came from Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic republics. The program exposed them to a process of deliberate desensitization to violence. Those who completed the training were deployed to the camps of Operation Reinhard, the Nazi plan for the systematic extermination of the Jews of Poland. This operation was named after Reinhard Heydrich, head of the Reich Security Central Office and one of the main architects of the final solution, who was killed in an attack in Prague in May 1942. The role of the Trauniki-Männer in the death camps was crucial to the functioning of the system. The SS did not have enough troops to manage on its own the daily operation of camps that processed thousands of victims every day. Ukrainian, Latvian, and Belarusian auxiliaries covered the surveillance posts on the perimeter, escorted the victims from the trains to the cameras, and operated the technical machinery of the extermination. Their presence allowed the small number of German SS officers to concentrate on supervision and administration. Marchenko was assigned to Treblinka in about the summer of 1942, when the camp became fully operational. Together with another Ukrainian guard surnamed Nikolai, whose full surname was not established with certainty in subsequent trials, he was left in charge of the technical operation of the gas chambers. The execution mechanism at Treblinka used carbon monoxide produced by the exhaust of a tank engine connected by pipes to the airtight chambers. The engine roared in a room next to the cameras, and the death process took between 20 and 25 minutes. The building that housed Treblinka's original gas chambers had 3 compartments. Each one measured approximately 5 meters by 5 meters and could hold between 200 and 300 standing people, completely compressed. When the camp needed to increase its capacity in the autumn of 1942, Jankiel Viernik, whose skills as a carpenter and builder had been identified by the guards, was forced to supervise the construction of a new building with 10 larger chambers. Viernik had to design and build the facility where tens of thousands of people, including likely members of his own community, would be killed. This obligation constituted for him a specific form of psychological torture that he described precisely in his testimony: the impossibility of refusing, the certainty that rejection meant his immediate death, and the awareness that accepting meant participating in the extermination of others. But what distinguished Marchenko from a simple technical operator was what happened in the corridor before the victims entered the chambers. Testimonies collected during the post-war trials, as well as accounts from survivors of the August 1943 uprising, describe Marchenko with terrifying consistency. He was a tall man with an imposing physique, about 25 years of age at the time of his service at Treblinka. Witnesses agree that he had an expression that could seem calm, almost friendly, in absolute contrast to his behavior. Marchenko, according to multiple testimonies documented in the Yad Vashem archives and in the records of the Nuremberg trial, waited at the entrance of the chambers with an iron rod or sometimes with a sword. As the naked crowd of men, women and children was forced inside, Marchenko beat and cut and mutilated the victims at random. The violence had no operative logic, it was pure expression of sadism. There was a distinction in Treblinka that survivors make in their testimonies between functional violence, that which served to maintain the movement of the victims and ensure that the extermination process ran smoothly, and gratuitous violence, that which served no operational purpose and was simply the expression of the perpetrator's personal pleasure. Marchenko was the most extreme exponent of the second category, but not the only one. Survivors' testimonies mention several guards for their specific behaviors. Some were described as mechanically violent but with no apparent enjoyment, while others, and Marchenko was the most documented case, showed unmistakable signs of satisfaction in the face of the suffering they inflicted. Witnesses described specific scenes in detail that could hardly have been fabricated. In one of the most documented narratives, a survivor recounted Marchenko tearing off some prisoners' ears with his bare hands and nailing them to the wooden walls of the corridor. In other cases, according to testimonies, he would gouge out the eyes of prisoners and crush them between his fingers while the rest of the crowd was forced to witness the act. There are accounts of Marchenko stabbing women in the thighs and genitals as they advanced towards the cameras, and of his involvement in pre-execution rapes. The consistency of these details between testimonies of people who did not know each other and who gave testimony in different countries and decades gives this set of stories a documentary solidity that the historical courts considered irrefutable. What the testimonies also reveal, and which constitutes one of the most disturbing aspects of Marchenko's profile, is the performative nature of his violence. He didn't just act with sadism, he exhibited it. He laughed as he did so. He made comments in Ukrainian to his colleagues while torturing the victims. According to several witnesses, his face showed an expression that they independently and consistently described as joy. This exhibitionist component suggests that part of the function that violence had for Marchenko was the assertion of power in front of his peers, the establishment of a hierarchy of brutality within the guard system itself. Psychologist James Waller, in his study Becoming Evil, published in 2002, analyzed the testimonies of perpetrators of Treblinka and other fields in the context of institutionalized cruelty psychology. Their findings point out that individuals like Marchenko were not necessarily clinical psychopaths in the strict sense of the term before their incorporation into the system. They were people whose normal social inhibitors had been progressively eliminated by the environment of total impunity that the death camps created. The relevant question, Waller concludes, is not what kind of monster Marchenko was before Treblinka, but what kind of system makes a person what Marchenko became. One of the crudest accounts, recorded in the context of legal proceedings against the man believed for decades to be Marchenko, described the following scene. On an afternoon when the guard appeared to be particularly irritated, he ripped a baby she was carrying from a prisoner's arms and threw it against the wall. The baby died instantly. Another survivor described how Marchenko enjoyed listening to the sounds made by the victims from outside the sealed chambers during the 20 minutes of the process, standing by the wall with a satisfied expression on his face. The floors of the corridor and the area adjacent to the chambers were covered after each operation with remains, teeth, fragments of skin, torn clothes. The smell of blood and chemicals used by the Sonderkommandos to clean between processing was, according to accounts, unbearable after a few weeks. Marchenko was last seen in Yugoslavia in 1945, according to the testimony of camp guards captured after the war. His real whereabouts were never confirmed with certainty. In the 1970s, an extraordinary legal case focused international attention on a Ukrainian immigrant from Cleveland, Ohio, named John Demjanjuk, who was positively identified by several survivors in lineups as Ivan the Terrible. In 1988, an Israeli court found him guilty and sentenced him to death. However, in 1993, Israel's Supreme Court overturned the verdict. New evidence from declassified Soviet archives suggested that Ivan of Treblinka may have been Marchenko and not Demjanjuk, whose name did appear in Sobibor camp records. Demjanjuk returned to the United States. In 2009, he was deported to Germany, where in 2011 he was convicted for his participation as a guard in Sobibor, sentenced to 5 years in prison. He died in 2012 with his appeal pending. The Demjanjuk case established jurisprudence in Germany by determining that the mere documented presence as a guard in an extermination camp was sufficient to establish complicity in the murder without the need to prove specific individual acts. This legal interpretation changed the framework of trials for Holocaust crimes in Germany and led to the last criminal proceedings against former Nazi camp guards held in the country during the second decade of the 21st century, when the defendants were already between 90 and 100 years old. The definitive identity of Ivan the Terrible remains unresolved with absolute legal certainty. But what happened in that corridor, regardless of who exactly was wielding the iron bar, is documented by dozens of witnesses who had no reason to invent it. The Sonderkommandos, forced to be part of the machinery. If there was a specific punishment reserved for those at Treblinka whom the Nazis decided to keep alive temporarily, it was the obligation to become cogs in the extermination itself. The Sonderkommandos of Treblinka were men, mainly young Jews in good physical health, selected on the arrival platform to be assigned to maintenance tasks of the extermination process. Unlike at Auschwitz, where there was a formal selection with SS doctors evaluating new arrivals, at Treblinka the selection was brief and arbitrary. A guard would point to those who seemed strongest and shout at them to get out of line. The others continued towards the gas chambers. The tasks assigned to the Sonderkommandos were designed to destroy the mind as well as the body. They were to sort through the clothes and personal belongings of the recently murdered victims. They had to extract the gold teeth from the corpses before they were buried or cremated. They were to escort the new victims who arrived on each train, guide them to the stripping barracks, and in some cases lead them into the final corridor while pretending that it was all part of an ordinary hygiene process. This last point is the most disturbing of all. Some Sonderkommandos were forced to actively reassure the victims, to tell them that they were in a transit camp, that they would soon continue their journey, that showers were necessary for sanitary reasons. This put the forced prisoners in a position of complicity with the deception that was imposed on them. They knew they were lying. They knew what that lie was for, and if they refused to lie, they were executed immediately. The penalties for the slightest act of resistance or carelessness at work were brutal. According to the testimonies collected by the Israeli historian Yitzhak Arad in his definitive study of the Operation Reinhard camps published in 1987, the guards used various forms of specific punishment on the Sonderkommandos. One of the most documented was the inverted suspension. The prisoner was hung upside down, tied by the ankles, for hours. Blood pooled in the head, producing intracranial pressure that became unbearable within the first hour. If the prisoner survived the time of punishment, he was returned to his duties. Public beatings in front of the Sonderkommandos as a whole were used for a dual purpose, to punish the offender and to psychologically paralyze the rest. The fear of collective punishment, the possibility that one's mistake would trigger reprisals on all, was a tool of control of documented effectiveness. Those who tried to hide an object of value, save a piece of food, or show any sign of resistance, were in many cases summarily executed next to the graves they themselves had filled. The Sonderkommando of Treblinka knew from day one that their survival was temporary. The Nazis periodically replaced these groups to eliminate witnesses. This certainty of one's imminent death, combined with the daily obligation to participate in the process of extermination of people who were often relatives, neighbors or members of their own communities, constituted a psychological torture of unprecedented depth in history. Oskar Stroczynski, one of the few Sonderkommandos of Treblinka who survived the uprising and documented his experiences, described the mental state of the forced prisoners in these terms. It was not possible to cry. Crying presupposed feeling, and feeling fully would have meant collapsing. Those who survived the longest were the ones who learned to dissociate, to observe what was happening as if their own eyes belonged to someone else. Our Treblinka 1, the death slow, a few kilometers from immediate extermination. Less than 2 kilometers from the death camp, Treblinka 1 existed as its sinister counterpoint. If in Treblinka 2 death was almost instantaneous, in Treblinka 1 it was gradual, slowly and deliberately prolonged. The Treblinka 1 forced labor camp had been established before the extermination camp in June 1941. It mainly detained Poles arrested for violations of the occupation regime, not carrying documentation, trading without permission on the black market, violating ghetto rules, or simply having been arrested in random raids. The distinction between guilty and innocent was practically non-existent. The Germans needed forced labor, and anyone stopped in the radius of their operations was eligible. The camp was placed under the administrative authority of the Warsaw District of the General Government, the occupied Polish territory that had not been directly annexed to the German Reich. Its first commander was SS Hauptsturmführer Theodor van Eupen, under whose direction the camp adopted a regime of labor and punishment that would be maintained and deepened by his successors. Van Eupen established from the first month a system of daily production quotas for the quarry. Each team of prisoners had to extract and transport a minimum amount of cubic meters of gravel. Failure by any member of the team to comply with the quota triggered collective punishment on the entire group, a mechanism that put prisoners in conflict with each other and hindered internal solidarity. The economic heart of the camp was the gravel quarry, exploited for the construction of roads and railway works in occupied Poland. Prisoners worked from dawn until darkness fell, with no set breaks, pulling stones from the ground with pickaxes, shovels and tools that were often in poor condition. The days lasted between 14 and 16 hours in summer. In the winter months, work continued in temperatures as low as -20 degrees, with insufficient clothing, no gloves, with feet covered only by boots that were often not the right size. The gravel mined at Treblinka 1 had a specific destination, the project to build the highway that the Nazis planned to cross occupied Polish territory from north to south. This infrastructure project, designed for military and economic use by the Reich, was never completed. But during the years of operation of the forced labor camp, it consumed thousands of hours of forced labor and contributed to the deaths of hundreds of prisoners who succumbed to exhaustion, illness, or direct violence by the guards. The composition of the population of Treblinka 1 was more heterogeneous than that of the death camp. In addition to Polish Jews, the camp housed non-Jewish Poles, Gypsies, and at specific times Soviet prisoners of war. This mixture created internal tensions that the guards actively exploited: the unequal distribution of rations, the preferential allocation of certain less strenuous jobs, differential access to facilities such as the camp hospital, all of which were structured to create internal hierarchies that atomized prisoners and made collective organization difficult. The beatings were constant and did not require justification. The camp guards, mostly SS men with full mandates to apply the level of violence they deemed appropriate, beat prisoners who slowed down, made mistakes, looked in the wrong direction, or simply when the guard was in a bad mood. Whoever fell to the ground due to exhaustion was beaten until he got up. Anyone who could not get up was executed on the spot, his body dragged and deposited in a pit behind the field. The relationship between Treblinka 1 and Treblinka 2 also had a concrete functional dimension. Some of the prisoners in the forced labor camp were occasionally used in logistical support tasks for the death camp, including transporting construction materials, supplying firewood for the Operation 1005 bonfires, and maintenance work on the outlying facilities. These temporary transfers exposed the prisoners of Treblinka 1 to the reality of what was happening in the neighboring camp, although many already knew or sensed it from the smoke, smell, and constant sound of the engine of the gas chambers that reached their barracks on windy days. The diet at Treblinka 1 was calculated to keep prisoners at the minimum threshold of functionality. The rations consisted of a watery soup of beetroot or turnips in the morning and a similar portion in the evening. In many periods of the field's operation, these quantities were further reduced. The result was prisoners with visible signs of chronic malnutrition after a few weeks, skin on bones, edema in the extremities, inability to concentrate, impaired vision. The so-called camp hospital was one of the most sinister institutions in Treblinka 1. It formerly existed as a medical facility, with a doctor-prisoner forced to practice without basic medicines or instruments. But their actual role was different. Prisoners who arrived at the hospital with illnesses or injuries that made them unable to work were classified as non-recoverable in most cases. and their transfer to the hospital was often the pre-execution step. Prisoners were aware of this reality and avoided reporting illnesses until physical incapacity was impossible to hide. This denial of one's own suffering, practiced day after day, had severe physical consequences: infected wounds that progressed without treatment, respiratory diseases that turned into pneumonia, minor fractures that, when not immobilized correctly, produced permanent deformities. Diseases proliferated due to hygienic conditions. Wooden barracks without thermal insulation, with plank platforms where prisoners slept pressed against each other, were perfect vectors for dysentery, typhus, and respiratory infections. In summer, mosquitoes that proliferated in the puddles near the camp transmitted fevers that weakened prisoners in a matter of days. In winter, the ice on the floor of the barracks caused prisoners sleeping on the lower levels of the platforms to wake up with icy clothes and numb feet. The specific punishment system of Treblinka I included a practice documented in several testimonies that does not appear as frequently in accounts from other camps: the obligation to perform strenuous physical exercise as a sanction. Prisoners who had committed infractions were forced to run in circles for hours, perform repeated push-ups until they collapsed, or carry excessive weights in forced positions. This form of punishment, apparently less brutal than beatings but equally destructive to bodies already weakened by hunger and work, was used with particular frequency by certain guards who seemed to find in it a satisfaction different from that of direct violence. Historian Samuel Willenberg, who was deported to Treblinka II in October 1942 and was one of the few survivors of the 1943 uprising, described being able to hear from the death camp the sounds coming from the nearby forced labor camp. The noise of work in the quarry, the screams of guards, the dull thud of the tools against the stone. That auditory presence of parallel suffering was part of the permanent sound fabric of Treblinka. The ultimate fate of the Treblinka I prisoners who had not died during their internment was determined by the circumstances of the camp's closure. When the activity of the neighboring death camp ceased in October 1943, the logistical raison d'etre of Treblinka I disappeared as well. The prisoners who were still alive at that time, whose exact number is not precisely documented, but which historians estimate at a few dozen, were liquidated before the definitive closure. The rule that had governed the operation of both camps from day one also applied in the end. No witnesses were to be left. Operation 1005: destroy evidence, torture with the certainty of one's own death. In the spring of 1943, when the Soviet advance began to make it clear that Germany might lose the war, Heinrich Himmler ordered the implementation of Operation 1005 in all Operation Reinhard death camps. The reason was concrete. In April 1943, Nazi Germany had publicly revealed the discovery of the Katyn graves, where the Soviet NKVD had executed approximately 22,000 Polish military officers and citizens between 1940 and 1941. The Nazi regime had used this finding as propaganda against the Soviets. But the unexpected effect was that the Nazi hierarchs themselves became aware of what it meant for the world to discover mass graves, documented evidence of crimes against humanity, and, in the scenario of a possible German defeat, the legal basis for post-war trials. Operation 1005 was not designed exclusively for Treblinka. It was a systematic program that covered all sites of mass murder in the occupied territory of the East, from the camps of Operation Reinhard in Poland to the sites of mass shootings in Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic countries. The officer responsible for its overall coordination was SS Standartenführer Paul Blobel, who had commanded the Einsatzgruppe that perpetrated the Babi Yar massacre in September 1941, where 33,771 Jews were killed in 2 days. Blobel thus had a personal as well as an institutional interest in the destruction of evidence. He was responsible for some of the greatest crimes that the operation sought to conceal. He was tried in Nuremberg, sentenced to death and executed in 1951. At Treblinka, Operation 1005 began to be implemented in the spring of 1943, when mass transports from Warsaw had already ceased and the camp was in a phase of reduced activity. The Sonderkommandos were organized into specific brigades for exhumation work, with an estimated number of prisoners at around 300 in the period of greatest activity of the operation. Himmler ordered the bodies to be exhumed and burned. At Treblinka, this order turned the Sonderkommandos into diggers of their own history. The Treblinka graves contained bodies in various states of decomposition. Those who had been buried in the first months of the camp's operation during the summer of 1942 had been underground for almost a year. The process of decomposition in sandy soil, with a relatively high water table in the Mazovian region, had progressed heterogeneously. Some bodies were almost completely skeletonized, while others, deeper or in areas with lower humidity, were partially preserved. The opening of the pits released accumulated decomposition gases that could cause loss of consciousness in workers who did not leave in time. The prisoners forced to dig them up faced working conditions that no human being should have faced. Modern forensic archaeologists working on exhumations of massacre victims use respiratory protective equipment, special suits, reinforced latex gloves, and strict post-traumatic stress management protocols that include frequent rotations and psychological support. The prisoners at Treblinka worked barehanded, without masks, without rotations, without any form of psychological support, under the constant supervision of guards who beat them if they slowed down. The Nazis had brought railroad tracks from Germany that they used to build huge grills over open pits, with alternating layers of wood and bodies. The engineering of these bonfires had been developed in the other fields of Operation Reinhard, particularly in Sobibor, where the first experiments with methods of mass cremation in the open air had been carried out. The technical problem the Nazis faced was that human bodies do not burn easily without additional fuel, especially when they are partially decomposed and have high moisture concentrations. The solution was to alternate layers of wood between the bodies and use accelerator fuel, often gasoline or motor oil, to initiate and maintain combustion. The fires thus lit burned for days. The smell stretched for miles. Residents of Malkinia Gorna and other villages within a 10-kilometer radius described in post-war testimonies seeing plumes of dark smoke for weeks and recognizing the source of the smell, although many said they were unable or unwilling to confront that knowledge directly. This denial of civilian witnesses near the death camps has been studied by historians as one of the most complex psychological and social phenomena in the history of the Holocaust. The distinction between not knowing, suspecting, knowing but not acting, and knowing and actively collaborating forms a spectrum whose investigation remains open. The bones that were not completely consumed in the fire were crushed with machines brought expressly for that function. The earth was turned over and over again until it was reduced to ashes mixed with human remains. In some sectors of the camp, prisoners had to sift through the earth after cremation to recover metal objects that had not been completely melted. Buckles, coins, remains of jewelry. These objects were collected and sent to the SS materials recycling system, integrating them into the Reich's war economy. Treblinka not only killed, he intended to disappear even the evidence of the crime. For the Sonderkommandos forced to perform this work, the psychological dimension was even more devastating. Among the bodies they dug up, they could find those of their own relatives, deported in previous transports. Several testimonies describe the experience of recognizing a piece of clothing, a personal object, or a physical feature in the remains they were digging up. Impotence in the face of this recognition, the impossibility of stopping work, was an unprecedented form of torture. An additional element of Operation 1005 that is rarely mentioned was the instruction to mix the ashes with topsoil and, in some cases, scatter them over arable fields adjacent to the perimeter of the field. This practice, documented in at least one of the survivors' testimonies, took the destruction of evidence to a level that transcended the merely logistical. It was the literal dissolution of the dead in the earth, the turning of the victims into dust without mark or geographical reference. The ultimate goal was not just that there would be no bodies, it was that there would be no ground that could be pointed out as the place where someone lay. And they all knew something else. When Operation 1005 was over, when there were no more graves to empty and no more evidence to destroy, they themselves would be eliminated. The camp would close, and those who knew what had happened could not be left alive. The certainty of one's own imminent death lived day by day while destroying the evidence of the crime that one had been forced to witness oneself was the last and cruelest circle of the Treblinka torture system. The uprising of August 2, 1943, was not an act of hope in the conventional sense. It was the logical response of people who had accurately calculated that their only possible future inside the camp was death in the coming weeks. Operation 1005 robbed the prisoners of the ultimate reason for passivity. If they were going to die anyway, the only real choice they had was how. Starvation as a method. Systematic deprivation at Treblinka 1. While in Treblinka 2 starvation was irrelevant because no one lived long enough to suffer it, in Treblinka 1 food deprivation was as deliberate and functional an instrument of control as the guards' own beatings. The forced labor camp's food regimen was precisely calculated to keep prisoners at the lowest threshold of physical functionality that would still allow them to work. The investigations of the nutritionists of the Nuremberg medical trial, carried out between 1946 and 1947, established that the rations supplied in the camps of Operation Reinhard were equivalent to between 400 and 800 calories per day, in a context where an adult manual worker needs between 2,500 and 3,000 calories to maintain his weight and his work capacity. The result of this heat gap was predictable and foreseen by the Nazi planners themselves. The prisoners began to lose weight from the first week. After a month, the physical deterioration was visible. At 2 or 3 months, those who were still alive showed symptoms of advanced malnutrition, edema of the limbs, hair that fell out, difficulty maintaining body temperature. After 4 or 5 months of that regime, most prisoners would have died if they had not been previously executed. Attempts to obtain additional food were severely punished. Any attempt to save a piece of bread, bribe a guard for an extra ration, or communicate with the outside of the camp to receive food from the nearby Polish population was treated as a serious infraction that carried corporal punishment, confinement in solitary confinement cells, or outright execution, depending on the mood of the guard and the policy of the commander in that period. This paradox was one of the most sophisticated mechanisms of the camp's system of everyday terrorism. They were systematically denied what was necessary to survive and then punished for trying to obtain it. Dehydration was another vector of deliberate suffering. Access to drinking water was strictly controlled. In summer, with temperatures exceeding 30 degrees in the months of July and August, prisoners doing strenuous physical labor in the quarry could arrive at their barracks at the end of the day in states of severe dehydration. Gastrointestinal diseases caused by the consumption of unsafe water were common and spread rapidly among the crowded population of the countryside. The cold of the Polish winter was another dimension of this calculated suffering. Temperatures in the Mazovia region can drop to 20 or even 25 degrees below zero in the months of December and January. The prisoners of Treblinka 1 worked in those temperatures in the same summer clothes, without coats, with the same deficient shoes that generated sores and wounds on their feet. Sleeping in the barracks without heating, with a single blanket for several prisoners and on wooden platforms uninsulated from the frozen floor, meant that the body never fully recovered heat between one day and the next. Some prisoners found ways to resist, sharing body heat by sleeping together, organizing clandestine exchanges of food with comrades who had access to the camp's warehouses, making small cushions from the available rags to protect the most injured feet. These microforms of solidarity, in a context where the regime was explicitly designed to atomize prisoners and prevent the formation of bonds, were acts of resistance that surviving witnesses recalled as essential to psychological survival. The violence of the guards, arbitrariness as a system. At Treblinka, violence was not just a consequence of the reign of terror, it was their main language of communication. The SS guards and Ukrainian auxiliaries trained in Troniki who operated the camp had been systematically desensitized to violence during their training. But the element that the survivors' testimonies emphasize most consistently is not desensitization, but arbitrariness. The violence at Treblinka did not follow a logic of punishment and reward understandable to the victims. A prisoner could be brutally beaten for doing exactly the same thing for which another prisoner was ignored. This unpredictability was itself an instrument of control. When violence is unpredictable, the body and mind are kept in a constant state of alert that the nervous system cannot sustain indefinitely. After weeks in that state, the prisoners developed what post-war psychiatrists documented as emotional dullness, a progressive decrease in reactivity to stimuli, a state of passivity that made them less likely to resist, but also less able to plan resistance. It was functionally a result that suited the operators of the field. The coded corporal punishments applied at Treblinka included flogging, usually with a leather whip or braided metal cables, applied to the prisoner's bare back while he was restrained. The standard number of lashes could be 5, 10, or 25, but in practice there was no real limit. The guard continued as he wished. Confinement in solitary confinement cells was another recurring punishment. In Treblinka 1, as in other camps of the Nazi network, there were punishment cells of reduced dimensions, approximately 1 square meter, where the prisoner was locked up standing without the possibility of sitting or lying down. There was no light, ventilation was minimal, and the time in those conditions could extend from 1 to several days. Prisoners returned to the barracks after days in those cells often could not walk unaided for hours. Hanging as a punishment and as a method of public execution was used with documented frequency. It was held in the central courtyard of the camp in the presence of all the other prisoners who were forced to form lines and observe. This forced exposure to the spectacle of death had an explicit psychological function, to demonstrate that execution was routine, that it could happen to anyone, and that no solidarity or individual resistance would change that reality. The dog as a weapon against the prisoners was a constant in the testimonies of the survivors of Treblinka. The guards used German shepherd dogs and other specially trained attack breeds to attack prisoners on command. The animals had been conditioned to respond to the guards' signals by throwing themselves on the victim's legs and arms. Frequent bites, which did not receive medical attention, were easily infected in the poor hygiene conditions of the camp. But perhaps the most sophisticated form of psychological torture practiced by the guards, and which the testimonies mention with a regularity that gives it authenticity, was the manipulation of hopes. The guards often promised perks, ration upgrades, or the possibility of transfer to less harsh conditions in exchange for information about prisoners' resistance plans. In several documented cases, these promises led to the denunciation of comrades and the subsequent execution, not only of those informed but also of the informer, once his usefulness as an informant had been exhausted. The uprising, when resistance replaced fear. The organization of the Treblinka uprising was one of the most extraordinary clandestine operations carried out under conditions of absolute terror during the whole of World War II. The prisoners who began planning the rebellion in the early months of 1943 knew that time was running out. Operation 1005, the emptying of the graves, was advancing. When it was over, the camp would close and they would be eliminated as witnesses. The equation was simple and ruthless: rebel and probably die trying, or wait and die with certainty in a gas chamber. They chose the first option. The initial organization of the uprising was headed by Zygmunt Stroczynski, known within the camp as Zelomir, and by former Polish army captain Julian Koronzitki, a doctor by profession. Koronzitki became the central figure of the early preparations, gathering money and valuables confiscated from victims in an attempt to bribe corrupt guards and obtain weapons. When his activities were discovered in the spring of 1943, Koronzitki ingested poison before being captured, avoiding torture and protecting information about his accomplices. The blow was devastating but not fatal to the conspiracy. Leadership passed to another Polish military officer, identified in the testimonies as Dr. Berek Lejcha, who initially set the date of the uprising for June 15, 1943. An unexpected incident forced the postponement. A group of prisoners with no connection to the main conspiracy managed to smuggle a grenade into the camp and set it off. The SS immediately stepped up security measures. The conspirators waited. August 2, 1943, dawned in unusual heat. Many of the guards had left the camp to bathe in a nearby river, temporarily reducing the number of guards. The conspirators had managed to duplicate the key to the armament room through one of the prisoners who worked as a blacksmith. That morning, the plan went live. The rebels distributed the rifles, grenades, and pistols they had managed to accumulate. At 4 in the afternoon, the signal was given. In the following minutes, they sprayed strategic buildings in the countryside with stolen kerosene and detonated the fuel depot. The explosion was visible from miles away. The flames spread quickly. In the chaos of the fire, hundreds of prisoners ran to the barbed wire. The mistake that cost most of them their lives was not cutting the telephone lines in the camp. The SS immediately requested reinforcements, and trucks with additional troops arrived within minutes. Machine guns from watchtowers opened fire on prisoners trying to cross the perimeter. Many were entangled in the barbed wire. The leader of the uprising, Berek Laicha, was killed in the shootout. It is estimated that between 200 and 300 prisoners managed to leave the camp during the chaos. Most were recaptured or killed in the pursuit that immediately followed the uprising. The Nazis mobilized machine gun cars and mounted troops to scour the surrounding forests. One of the survivors described the escape as follows: "A car was chasing us with a machine gun firing in all directions. Many fell dead. He changed direction and ran to the left. The car was soon in front of me." It is estimated that between 60 and 70 people managed to successfully escape and survive the war. Among them were Jankiel Wiernik, Samuel Willenberg, Richard Glaser, and Oskar Stroczynski, whose testimonies became the documentary pillars of the history of Treblinka. After the uprising, the Nazis made the decision not to rebuild the camp. Treblinka, too, had already served its purpose. The extermination of Warsaw's Jewish community was virtually complete. On October 19, 1943, the Treblinka extermination camp closed for good. The last prisoners were eliminated. Erasure, building a farm on death. The Nazis were not satisfied with closing Treblinka. They tried to make its existence disappear. After the uprising and closure of the camp, the SS ordered the systematic dismantling of all structures. The barracks were dismantled piece by piece, the barbed wire torn from their poles, the gas chambers blown up with explosives and the rubble buried. The pits where the bodies had burned during Operation 1005 were leveled with tractors and covered with earth. The soil was repeatedly ploughed to erase any topographical irregularities that might indicate the presence of underground structures. On the ruins, the Germans built a farm. A Ukrainian peasant was installed in the place with his family. Young trees were planted on the grounds of the old field. Within months, the place where nearly 1 million people had died in less than a year and a half looked like ordinary agricultural property in the forested landscape of northeastern Poland. This erasure effort was the latest expression of the logic that had governed Treblinka since its first day of operation. The camp had been designed not only to kill, but so that no trace of those killed would remain. No bodies, no names, no structures, no physical memory. But the erasure was not total. The few survivors who had escaped carried in their memory something that no leveling of land could destroy: the precise knowledge of what had happened, with names, dates, methods, and scales. Jankiel Wiernik had written his testimony in 1944, just months after his escape. The text was published clandestinely, reproduced in Poland, and taken abroad by resistance couriers. It reached the Allies before the war ended. Decades after 1945, when historians and archaeologists began to systematically study the terrain of the ancient field, subsurface analysis techniques confirmed what the testimonies had already established. Georadar and controlled excavations located the foundations of the structures, the combustion pits and the layers of removed earth that documented the extermination process and the subsequent attempt to erase it. Today, the Treblinka Memorial consists of thousands of irregular stones planted on the grounds of the former camp, each representing a Jewish community destroyed by Operation Reinhard. A granite monolith marks the area where the gas chambers were located. The trails that run through the memorial follow approximately the route of the railroad tracks and the extermination corridor. The place is quiet. The forest that surrounds it grew on the ashes.